Alabama, 1944. Dawn breaks pale over the red clay fields outside a fenced compound. The air is cool, still carrying the faint smell of fried dough and roasted beans drifting from the camp kitchen. Inside, rows of German prisoners shuffle toward a mess tent, metal cups clinking at their belts. Steam rolls out from the flap as U.S. Army cooks ladle coffee into dented mugs. Next to them, racks of golden donuts cool on wire trays. The scent, sweet, warm, almost unreal, hangs in the morning air. A few prisoners glance at one another, half smiling, unsure if this is real or mockery. They had expected punishment, scarcity, perhaps hunger. Instead, a corporal in a khaki apron waves them forward, calling in English and broken German, "Hot coffee, don't wait." Beyond the barbed wire, guards stand easy, rifles slung casually. A Victrola plays faintly from a guardhouse window, Bing Crosby's voice carried on the wind. For men who had marched under the swastika across half of Europe, the simple taste of a donut and hot coffee is disorienting. Here, in the heart of their enemy's homeland, they are discovering a truth that shocks them more than defeat itself. America does not starve its prisoners, it feeds them. When the first German prisoners stepped onto American soil in 1942, most were stunned before a single guard spoke. They had crossed an ocean expecting cages, punishment, perhaps forced labor under armed supervision. Instead, they found neat rows of wooden barracks, orderly kitchens, medical tents, and lawns that looked more like summer camps than prisons. By war's end, more than 371,000 German POWs would live across 501 major base camps and 500 branch camps spread over 46 states. They arrived first from North Africa, captured in Operation Torch and the Tunisian campaign, then from Italy and the collapsing Western Front. The United States, shielded from the physical destruction of war, had both the space and the resources to house them humanely. This system was governed by something few of the prisoners had ever trusted: international law. The 1929 Geneva Convention on the Treatment of Prisoners of War required signatories to provide food, medical care, and shelter equal to that of their own troops. The United States Army followed it almost obsessively. It was not sentiment, it was strategy. Humane treatment, officials reasoned, would encourage the Axis to treat captured Americans the same way. Each camp fell under the oversight of the U.S. Army Provost Marshal General's office. Conditions were standardized. POWs received 3 meals per day, medical care through Army doctors, and wages for labor, 80 cents per day, in scrip redeemable at the camp canteen. At first, the German officers refused the food. Propaganda, they muttered, assuming the Americans wanted to soften them. But hunger and curiosity broke suspicion. The first meals astonished them: beef stew, potatoes, bread still warm, and a beverage they had heard about but never truly tasted: coffee. To the Germans, real coffee had vanished years earlier. Wartime rationing in Europe had replaced it with substitutes made from roasted acorns or barley. For men accustomed to black ersatz brew, the rich bitterness of American coffee was intoxicating. It became the daily anchor of life behind the wire. The contrast between expectations and reality shaped everything that followed. Guards and prisoners rarely exchanged hostility. U.S. officers were instructed to treat captives with firm fairness, avoiding humiliation. Many guards were barely older than the prisoners, farm boys from Kansas, mechanics from Detroit, serving far from combat, but mindful that American sons were in German hands too. Camp life developed its own rhythm: reveille at dawn, roll call, breakfast. Work detachments left for surrounding farms, sawmills, or canneries, filling the labor gap left by men overseas. Evenings brought soccer matches, concerts, and study groups. Some camps had orchestras, others, libraries stocked with German classics and English dictionaries. The food, predictable, abundant, and seasoned with American staples, became a quiet revelation. Bread with butter, meat every day, fresh fruit when available. POW menus followed the same nutritional guidelines as those used for American troops, averaging 3,500 calories per day. When civilian rations tightened in 1944, some locals complained that the prisoners eat better than we do. For the Germans, the breakfast line became both ritual and reassurance. It was the moment they learned that in this strange enemy land, dignity could exist even in captivity. The first camp kitchens improvised heavily. Flour, sugar, and lard were shipped from Army quartermaster depots. Coffee came in huge burlap sacks marked U.S. Army Grade A. Donuts, cheap, filling, and easy to mass produce, quickly joined the menu. They could be fried before dawn and served hot at reveille. The pairing, coffee and donuts, wasn't designed for comfort. It was logistical efficiency. But to the prisoners who had endured hunger marches and ration coupons, it felt like mercy. Letters home, carefully censored but honest, began mentioning these breakfasts. One POW wrote from a camp in Texas. Every morning, the guards bring coffee as black as tar and small cakes fried in oil. We laugh because it smells like peace. In those words lay the quiet paradox of wartime America, a nation capable of both overwhelming destruction abroad and measured decency at home. For Washington, that image mattered. Every cup poured and every donut served carried a message, not just to the prisoners, but to the world. America was showing that it could defeat its enemies without becoming them. And as more transports of weary, sunburned men arrived from the Atlantic ports, the question emerged among the new arrivals: was this discipline or compassion? The answer was somewhere in between. By 1944, the POW network in the United States had evolved into one of the largest controlled systems of human custody in modern history. From the pine forests of Georgia to the plains of Kansas, from the deserts of Arizona to the snowfields of Wisconsin, German prisoners lived in a world governed by Army regulation and routine. Each camp followed the same architecture: wooden barracks, chain-link fences topped with barbed wire, floodlights, and guard towers. Yet beyond the symbolism of captivity, the daily rhythm was surprisingly ordinary. The Army understood something simple but profound: predictability was power. The less anxious the prisoners, the less likely they were to rebel or escape. Every morning began the same way: a bugle call at sunrise, roll call by squads, then the sound of the mess bell and the smell of coffee drifting from the cookhouse. Inside, American cooks, often assisted by POW volunteers, prepared huge metal tubs of food. Each prisoner received a tray, utensils, and coffee poured from 10-gallon urns into tin cups. It was served black, sometimes with milk or sugar if supplies allowed. Donuts or fried dough rings appeared frequently, part of a standard sweet breakfast rotation. The menu wasn't luxury, it was military practicality. Flour and lard were cheap, easy to transport, and provided calories for men who would spend their days cutting timber or picking cotton under the sun. What shocked the Germans was not the food itself, but the dignity of its delivery. No shouting, no beatings, no guards throwing rations through wire fences. Food was served on plates. Coffee was poured into mugs. Each man ate sitting down. Many of the cooks were draftees, ordinary Americans fulfilling kitchen duty instead of combat assignments. Some had brothers fighting in Europe, yet they followed orders strictly. Feed them like soldiers, not animals. It was a policy reinforced by the U.S. War Department, which warned that abuse of prisoners endangers our own. By mid-1944, the United States was hosting nearly 500,000 Axis prisoners, including Italians and a smaller number of Japanese. The majority were German, and most were still loyal to the Reich when they arrived. Camp intelligence officers noted varying degrees of fanaticism: hardline Nazis, apolitical conscripts, and disillusioned men who simply wanted to survive. The morning meal often revealed the difference. Those still steeped in ideology treated the food with suspicion, claiming it was softening them. Others, especially younger soldiers, welcomed it, grateful for any taste of normalcy. Within weeks, resentment gave way to routine. Cultural friction remained. Some guards resented the comfort afforded to captives. Small-town newspapers occasionally ran editorials asking why enemy soldiers eat sugar while our families ration it. The answer was practical and political. Adherence to the Geneva Convention protected American POWs in Europe and showcased American moral authority. Oversight was constant. International Red Cross inspectors visited each camp regularly, interviewing prisoners without guards present. Reports praised the U.S. for compliance and documented improvements, libraries, recreation halls, and even musical instruments. For the prisoners, the contrast with home was unbearable to contemplate. Letters arriving from Germany spoke of bombed cities, hunger, and scarcity. Families wrote of breadlines and surrogate coffee brewed from barley husks. Meanwhile, the men behind American fences woke to full stomachs and clean clothes. Some camps began offering classes in English, mathematics, and trades, part of a subtle re-education program run by the War Department's Special Projects Division. Prisoners read American newspapers, listened to radio broadcasts, and slowly absorbed the culture around them. The routine of coffee and donuts became more than sustenance. It was a symbol of a world functioning under different values. Even American civilians noticed. On nearby farms and in towns, locals working alongside POW labor detachments began trading food and small gifts. Children waved at the prisoners' trucks as they passed. Bakers in a few communities volunteered to send fresh pastries or bread to the camps on Sundays. In several documented cases, the local Salvation Army and Red Cross chapters delivered donuts, echoing the same ritual they performed for American GIs overseas. To German eyes, it was disorienting. They had been taught that democracy was chaos, that Americans were decadent and cruel. Yet every morning they stood in line for the same coffee and fried dough their guards drank. The dissonance worked quietly, day after day, reshaping perception more effectively than propaganda ever could. Within a few months, letters home no longer described captors. They described hosts. And somewhere between the fences, the food lines, and the smell of morning coffee, the first cracks in old loyalties began to form. The human shock. For most German prisoners, the first true culture shock wasn't language. It was breakfast. To men who had marched across North Africa, fought in Italy, or been pulled from the smoking ruins of Normandy, captivity had seemed a prelude to misery. Instead, the first morning in an American camp brought an aroma that could have belonged to another planet. They stood in line, watched guards pour steaming coffee into metal mugs, and realized this wasn't a trick. It wasn't propaganda or temporary kindness before interrogation. It was routine. Every morning, the same. Survivors later wrote about the disbelief. One POW from Rommel's Africa Corps, held in Georgia, recalled, "The coffee was real. The bread was fresh. I had not seen such food since before the war. I wondered if they had made a mistake." To a generation raised under scarcity and propaganda, abundance itself felt unnatural. The idea that the enemy could waste sugar on prisoners of war was incomprehensible. Yet this excess carried its own kind of discipline. The Americans weren't flaunting generosity. They were displaying order, confidence, and a moral superiority that struck deeper than any speech. The emotional impact was profound. Food became language, coffee became diplomacy. The shared act of eating, guards and prisoners consuming the same meal at the same hour, blurred the sharp lines of hatred. In that daily ritual, many prisoners experienced their first glimpse of how democracy behaved when no one was watching. the legal and ethical framework. Behind the scenes, this civility was deliberate policy. The U.S. Army's Provost Marshal General, Major General Archer L. Lurch, enforced Geneva Convention compliance as a matter of doctrine. Prisoners received equal rations to U.S. troops, with nutritional targets of 3,500 calories per day, meat, bread, vegetables, and coffee included. To the War Department, adherence to law was both moral and strategic. The U.S. expected over 90,000 of its own troops to be held by Axis powers. Good treatment of Germans, officials reasoned, improved the odds that captured Americans might be spared retaliation. Even at the height of domestic rationing, Army Quartermaster reports from 1944 confirmed that POW camps received standard troop rations. Substitutions were permitted only when ingredients were unavailable. When complaints surfaced about lavish meals, the War Department's response was unflinching. POWs are soldiers under our custody, not criminals. To treat them otherwise would dishonor our own. Medical care followed the same standard. Army doctors inspected POW kitchens weekly. Red Cross delegates reviewed menus. Each camp maintained records of caloric content and issued periodic reports to Washington. The result was a bureaucratic miracle of consistency. From Arizona desert camps to New England pine forests, the prisoners ate nearly the same breakfast. Ethics here served strategy. The coffee poured at dawn was as much a message as it was sustenance. It told every man behind the wire that America obeyed rules even when it didn't have to. That was a powerful contrast to the authoritarian world many of them came from. Security and discipline. A full stomach, Army psychologists noted, was the best deterrent to revolt. Order in the camps was maintained not through fear, but through reliability. Schedules never changed. Food lines moved at the same time every morning. Work crews departed on time, and even punishment details began after breakfast. Guards, many from the military police corps, understood the relationship between predictability and control. The Army's manual on POW operations stated bluntly, "Routine is security." When prisoners knew they would be fed, they didn't hoard. When they trusted that tomorrow would bring another meal, they didn't riot. Escapes were rare, and violence rarer still. The camps were fenced, but the real barrier was monotony and the simple satisfaction of being treated as soldiers rather than criminals. A cup of hot coffee became a kind of social contract. Discipline existed, of course. Nazi loyalists still tried to enforce ideological purity, forming secret groups known as Kameradschaftsbunde to intimidate those seen as soft. In some camps, U.S. authorities eventually separated hardliners from moderates to prevent violence. Yet even within these tensions, the food line remained neutral ground. It was the one place every prisoner could stand without politics, waiting for something familiar, the smell of coffee, the taste of dough fried in oil, the warmth of a meal served without cruelty. Cooks and guards both knew its importance. "We keep them calm with routine," one sergeant wrote in his journal. "Feed them well, and they behave well. It's not mercy, it's management." But over time, the difference between those two words, mercy and management, blurred. By turning discipline into decency, the United States discovered something deeper. Humane treatment wasn't weakness. It was stability disguised as kindness. And for men raised in a world where fear maintained order, that discovery was transformative. Labor and logistics. Behind the calm of morning coffee lay an immense logistical machine. By 1944, the United States was fighting a two-ocean war while still feeding its own civilian population. Millions of young men were overseas, leaving farms, canneries, and lumber mills short of hands. German POWs filled that vacuum. Under Geneva Convention rules, enlisted men could be required to work, paid modest wages in camp scrip redeemable for cigarettes, toiletries, and small luxuries. Every day after breakfast, trucks and buses rolled out from base camps carrying hundreds of prisoners to nearby work sites. In Alabama, they picked cotton. In Iowa, they harvested corn. In Oregon, they cut timber. The timing was deliberate. Breakfast at dawn, departure by 7, return by late afternoon. The coffee and donuts that began the day weren't simply kindness. They were fuel for the labor engine of wartime America. Quartermaster records show POWs contributed over 45 million man-days of labor by 1945, offsetting manpower shortages and keeping factories supplied. The irony was hard to ignore. The same men who had once vowed to destroy the United States were now quietly sustaining its wartime economy, energized by American coffee and guarded by teenagers from the Midwest. The efficiency of that system impressed even skeptics in Washington. It proved that compassion and productivity could coexist, a revelation that would later influence U.S. occupation policy in Germany itself. Culture and re-education food may have nourished bodies, but ideas fed the mind. By 1944, the Special Projects Division of the War Department began using POW camps as laboratories for democratic education. It wasn't indoctrination, it was exposure. Newspapers in German were printed weekly, highlighting Allied victories, labor rights, and civic freedoms. Libraries stocked translations of Emerson, Twain, and Lincoln speeches. In that environment, the mundane became symbolic. The morning coffee line demonstrated equality. Officers and enlisted men received the same rations. Guards and prisoners often drank from identical mugs. Over time, subtle lessons seeped in. Rules could exist without brutality. Hierarchy without tyranny. Lectures on history and economics followed. Some prisoners enrolled in voluntary classes about government and free enterprise. A few even learned English through menus and recipes. They began to understand that abundance wasn't decadence, it was organization. The re-education program was controversial inside the Army. Critics called it pampering. But commanders in the field saw results. Camp tensions eased, propaganda influence waned. By early 1945, many German prisoners were openly acknowledging defeat, not just militarily, but ideologically. The smell of coffee each morning had become, unknowingly, the prelude to a quiet conversion. Community encounters. As the war dragged on, boundaries between the camps and nearby towns grew porous. Civilians encountered the prisoners daily, in fields, canneries, sawmills. Many locals, after initial suspicion, found the Germans polite, disciplined, and grateful. Curiosity replaced hostility. American farmers began inviting work detachments to share midday meals under the shade of barns. Churches sent hymnals and donated surplus food. In several southern states, townsfolk organized Christmas drives for POWs, complete with pastries, pies, and inevitably, donuts. The Salvation Army and Red Cross, famous for providing donuts for GIs in Europe, extended the tradition to camps at home. Volunteers delivered boxes of pastries to prisoners during holidays. Reports from Camp Hearn in Texas and Camp Clinton in Mississippi described the same ritual. Trays of donuts, kettles of coffee, prisoners standing silently before breaking into applause. These gestures weren't sentimental, they were diplomatic. They humanized the enemy to small-town America and showed the world that democratic strength didn't require vengeance. For the Germans, the encounters left lasting impressions. Many later recalled that their first true glimpse of American character came not from propaganda leaflets, but from a civilian woman handing them a donut through a barbed wire fence. Those moments of quiet contact eroded decades of indoctrination more effectively than any lecture. The prisoners discovered that the enemy was human, and that humanity, expressed through something as simple as breakfast, could be stronger than hate. By the end of 1944, the POW camps had evolved into small, functioning societies, part military machine, part moral experiment. Within them, coffee and donuts were more than food. They were ritual, structure, and silent persuasion. The war overseas still raged, but inside America's fences, a different kind of victory was taking shape, one measured not in casualties, but in changed minds. That transformation would reach its quiet climax in the final year of the war, when the same routine that had once startled the new arrivals became their most cherished memory of captivity. By the summer of 1944, America's prisoner of war system had reached its peak. Every week, ships unloaded thousands of captured soldiers from North Africa and France at the ports of Norfolk, New York, and New Orleans. Trains carried them inland under armed guard to Kansas wheat fields, Georgia pine camps, Arizona desert stockades. And everywhere they arrived, the same smell greeted them before the guards did. Coffee, frying dough, and the faint sweetness of sugar carried on morning air. The routine had become an institution. At sunrise, bugles sounded across hundreds of compounds. Prisoners lined up in formation, the dew still thick on the grass, waiting for the first cup. Inside the cookhouses, army bakers ladled batter into deep iron pots, oil snapping and hissing as donuts surfaced golden. The rhythm was industrial, precise, unhurried, efficient. For many Germans, this consistency was more bewildering than captivity itself. They had believed American prosperity to be a myth created by Roosevelt's propaganda. Yet the proof stood in front of them. Steaming mugs poured without ration cards, bread made from white flour, tables stacked with fruit. This was not propaganda. It was daily life. Letters intercepted by the censors revealed the tone shifting from disbelief to admiration. One former Africa Corps sergeant wrote home, "They treat us like men. We have bread and real coffee. Even the guards joke, we work, we eat, we live. It is strange." Another confessed, "If this is defeat, then what have we been fighting for?" The Army noted the change. Reports from the Provost Marshal General's office described marked improvement in prisoner morale and increasing respect for American discipline and efficiency. What began as obedience enforced by fences was evolving into voluntary order. Prisoners no longer tested boundaries, they kept them. Then came the summer harvests of 1944, when thousands of POWs were dispatched to rural communities short of labor. They picked fruit in California, baled hay in Nebraska, and threshed wheat in the Dakotas. In many of these temporary branch camps, civilians replaced military cooks. The same coffee and donut breakfasts continued, now provided by local women's auxiliaries or church volunteers. The smell of fried dough in the early hours mixed with the hum of tractors and radios playing swing music. For the Germans, the exposure was transformative. They saw small-town America at work, farmers shaking hands with guards, children bringing baskets of eggs to camp kitchens, black and white workers laboring side by side. It was a vision completely at odds with everything Nazi propaganda had taught them. The shock was cultural, not culinary. Abundance without arrogance, authority without cruelty. When the prisoners asked why Americans fed them so well, one farmer reportedly replied, "Because we can." That simple answer carried a meaning deeper than any leaflet dropped over the front. It spoke of a civilization so confident in its strength that it didn't need to humiliate the defeated. The turning point wasn't marked by speeches or decrees. It came quietly, in hundreds of mess halls, on hundreds of mornings, as the line between captor and captive blurred into mutual respect. Guards poured second helpings. Prisoners cleaned up voluntarily. Some even began addressing the cooks by name. In the official records, these gestures appear as trivial entries. Orderly conduct during breakfast, no disturbances during morning meal. But behind the paperwork was a human reality that no statistic could measure. Germany's soldiers were discovering that their enemy's greatest weapon was decency. By late summer, American intelligence officers noticed a subtle shift in attitude among the POW population. Political hardliners still held meetings, but attendance dwindled. The camp orchestras played jazz alongside Beethoven. The prisoners asked for English dictionaries and requested American newspapers. In the words of one Army psychologist, they no longer feared us. They were beginning to understand us. That understanding reached its symbolic height one August morning at a camp in Oklahoma. The local Salvation Army arrived with fresh donuts, as they did for American soldiers overseas. When the prisoners realized the gesture was identical, they applauded. Some stood and removed their caps. The guards, startled, joined them. It was a moment without orders, a mutual recognition that something larger than war had crossed the wire. For men who had once marched under the Iron Cross, the hum of coffee urns and the laughter of American guards were not just comforts. They were revelations. And across 1,000 camps, that revelation was spreading, one breakfast at a time. Winter came early in 1944. Across the American heartland, POW camps prepared for the cold with extra fuel, thicker blankets, and a simple promise from the quartermaster: no prisoner would go hungry. It was a statement that no German believed until the first frost hit, and the smell of coffee still filled the air every morning. By then, thousands of new captives had arrived from Europe, men taken during the collapse of France after D-Day, and later from the battlefields of the Ardennes. Many came hollow-eyed, wearing tattered field coats, half-starved from the weeks of transport. They expected vengeance. What they found instead were the same wooden barracks, the same steady voices calling roll, and the same trays of fried dough and steaming mugs. One officer captured during the Battle of the Bulge later wrote in his memoir, "I expected a cage. I found a table." Even under the strain of logistics, the U.S. Army maintained its standard. Camps in Texas, Kansas, and Mississippi reported record numbers of prisoners, yet rations were not cut. When shortages threatened, civilian bakeries were contracted to deliver pastries. Milk was substituted with powdered cream, sugar rationed, but never withheld. To the prisoners, this consistency bordered on the miraculous. In the chaos of their defeat, it became the one stable thing left. The routine of coffee at dawn was no longer alien, it was comforting. Men who had once spat at the idea of American kindness now guarded their enamel mugs like personal relics. During Christmas 1944, the War Department authorized special holiday meals. POWs were served turkey, vegetables, fruit, and, by request, donuts sprinkled with powdered sugar. Guards and prisoners sang carols together across the barbed wire. Photographs from Camp Swift in Texas show rows of German soldiers raising coffee cups toward the camera, grinning beneath a sign that read, "Merry Christmas, peace will come." That winter also brought the peak of the re-education effort. The Special Projects Division distributed pamphlets explaining democratic governance, press freedom, and labor rights. Lectures were voluntary, but attendance grew steadily. The moral groundwork that had begun in the breakfast line now took intellectual form. One German teacher held at Camp McCain in Mississippi later said, "We began to see America not through propaganda, but through breakfast, books, and behavior." Yet the transformation wasn't uniform. A minority of Nazi loyalists resisted, convinced the kindness was strategic deception. They whispered that the food was meant to break discipline. But even they couldn't ignore the pattern. Months passed, and the pattern never changed. Outside the wire, the war raged on. The Ardennes burned, the Rhine crossings loomed, and Europe drowned in its own starvation. Inside America's fences, order and decency held. When news of Germany's devastation trickled in through censored letters, the POWs struggled with guilt. The nation that had been their sworn enemy was feeding them better than their own government could feed its citizens. For U.S. authorities, this wasn't indulgence. It was strategy perfected. Propaganda leaflets dropped over German lines emphasized it. Your comrades in American camps live well and work honorably. Surrender and live. Each image of a prisoner smiling with a mug of coffee served a dual purpose: psychological warfare abroad, stability at home. But for the men inside the camps, the effect was far more personal. Each Dawn cup, each fried donut, chipped away at indoctrination built over a decade. The realization settled slowly, almost painfully. The ideals they had been taught to hate might in fact be stronger than the ones they had fought to defend. When Germany finally surrendered in May 1945, the announcement reached many prisoners as they stood in line for breakfast. Guards read the news aloud. Some POWs cheered, others wept silently into their mugs. The war was over. But their mornings would continue the same: coffee, bread, and the steady hum of an America that seemed incapable of cruelty. One camp chaplain wrote afterward, "They expected a victory of arms. They found a victory of conscience." That quiet triumph, won without a shot fired, would shape what came next. For many prisoners, the America they had seen from behind barbed wire would linger longer than any ideology they'd carried into battle. In the end, it was not speeches or punishments that changed them. It was the same unremarkable act, repeated thousands of times: the pouring of coffee, the offering of food, the discipline of kindness. The same gesture that began as duty had become something else entirely, a symbol of a nation's strength through restraint. When the guns of Europe finally fell silent in May 1945, the vast network of prisoner-of-war camps across the United States stood as one of the war's most improbable legacies. Over 370,000 German captives now lived under a flag that had treated them not as enemies, but as men. For many, that realization was more difficult to comprehend than defeat itself. The War Department moved quickly to reorganize. Repatriation was required under the Geneva Convention, but the process would take time. Many of the prisoners were first transferred to temporary labor camps in Britain and France, where they worked to rebuild the very continents their armies had helped destroy. The American camps, however, remained operational into 1946 as the logistical machinery of return wound slowly forward. In those intervening months, a peculiar calm settled over the barbed wire. For the first time since their capture, the POWs faced a world without fear. They woke to familiar sounds: the whistle at dawn, the mess line, the clatter of trays. The same coffee and donuts were served, even though the war that had justified their captivity was over. The ritual persisted because it had become something deeper than policy. It was routine turned into reassurance. For the U.S. Army, these months were a delicate balance of compassion and pragmatism. The camps had to maintain order while preparing for closure. Guards were rotated home. Civilian workers took over kitchens. Yet discipline held, almost effortlessly. The prisoners policed themselves, cleaned barracks, repaired fences, and kept schedules as though the war still demanded it. Letters arriving from Germany painted a stark contrast. Families described ruins, food shortages, and children surviving on black market bread. POWs read these accounts in stunned silence. Many couldn't reconcile the image of hunger in their homeland with the abundance surrounding them in captivity. One camp interpreter in Texas noted, "They stopped asking for more. They started feeling guilty for what they already had." That guilt became reflection. In interviews conducted by the War Department's Psychological Warfare Division, former Wehrmacht soldiers repeatedly described their treatment as unbelievable. Some questioned whether their captors' kindness was real. Others concluded it must come from moral conviction. A former U-boat crewman detained in Maine told an American officer, "We thought freedom was weakness. Now we see it is discipline of another kind." Even civilians who had once criticized the leniency of the system began to see its results. Reports emerged of German prisoners volunteering to help with flood recovery, hospital construction, and community projects near their camps. In many states, relationships between locals and POW detachments evolved from wary coexistence to mutual trust. Farmers who had worked alongside the men for years offered them letters of recommendation for post-war employment. And as repatriation began, something unexpected happened. Some of the captives didn't want to leave. Applications poured in requesting permission to remain in America after release, requests that military law could not grant. The irony was painful. Men who had once fought to conquer democracy now begged to live within it. The War Department noted this transformation with quiet satisfaction. The policy of humane treatment had done more than prevent riots. It had reshaped loyalties. What started as adherence to Geneva rules had become a soft weapon of influence. The United States had won not only the war of arms, but a subtle war of perception. By the end of 1945, most major camps began closing. The final roll calls were held under gray winter skies. Trains waited on sidings to carry the prisoners east to ports. Before departure, every man received a final breakfast: coffee, donuts, fruit, and cigarettes. Guards and prisoners shook hands, some exchanging addresses, others a silent nod of understanding. At that moment, there was no triumph, no hatred, only acknowledgement. They had arrived as enemies. They left as witnesses. By early 1946, the camps that had once buzzed with daily life were emptying fast. Barbed wire fences sagged in the wind. Guard towers stood abandoned, their floodlights dark. What remained were footprints in the red dirt, a few scattered coffee tins, and the lingering smell of kitchens that had once baked 1,000 donuts a morning. The trains that carried the prisoners away were quiet affairs. There were no parades, no speeches, just men sitting in silence, clutching Army-issued parcels of food for the long voyage home. When they looked back through the windows, many saw a landscape they never expected to miss: green fields, calm order, and faces that had treated them with humanity instead of vengeance. Their journey didn't end in Germany. Many were diverted first to France and Britain, where they labored to rebuild bridges, clear mines, and repair bombed railways. The work was harsh, the rations meager. For the first time, they understood what starvation really felt like. And in that contrast, the memory of their time in America sharpened. Letters and diaries from returning POWs tell the same story. They spoke of coffee poured by guards who smiled, of donuts passed across canteen counters, of mornings that felt civilized even in captivity. Some were ashamed, others grateful. Many admitted that they had arrived in the U.S. as Nazis and returned to Germany as skeptics. One wrote simply, "We learned more about freedom from breakfast than from books." That sentiment echoed across post-war Germany. When the prisoners finally came home, they became unwitting ambassadors for a different image of America. In towns reduced to rubble, they described an enemy that fed rather than starved them, that obeyed laws even in victory, that turned compassion into discipline. Their stories carried weight. Ordinary Germans, weary of ruin, began to listen. Historians would later argue that these POW experiences, repeated by hundreds of thousands of returning men, helped lay the emotional groundwork for West Germany's democratic rebirth. They had seen a system that worked, a society that thrived on fairness rather than fear. And at its most human level, that revelation began with small rituals: coffee in tin mugs, fried dough dusted with sugar, kindness delivered without expectation of return. Back in the United States, many former camp guards and local civilians remembered the POWs fondly. Farmers spoke of their work ethic. Church volunteers recalled the strange gratitude of the men they once feared. In dozens of small towns, local newspapers printed farewells when the last transports departed. Some residents even wrote to the War Department requesting that their Germans be allowed to stay. A few did return, not as prisoners, but as immigrants. Between 1947 and 1955, hundreds of former POWs applied for visas under new post-war programs. They settled in Texas, Wisconsin, and Minnesota, building farms and businesses within sight of the land where they'd once been held. Many kept their camp-issued enamel mugs as souvenirs. For them, the line between captivity and belonging had blurred forever. In the archives of the U.S. Army Provost Marshal General, a final inspection report from 1946 captured the meaning of it all in one understated line. The humane treatment of enemy prisoners reflected credit upon the United States and contributed materially to post-war reconstruction. That was bureaucratic language for something deeper. The system had proven that morality could be logistical, that order could coexist with empathy. In a world that had just witnessed genocide and total war, the quiet dignity of those breakfast lines was a defiant act of civilization. Years later, when journalists interviewed former prisoners in Germany, they asked what they remembered most vividly about captivity in America. The answers were almost identical. The coffee, the donuts, the smell of the morning. They remembered not barbed wire or guards, but warmth. It was the smallest kindness, repeated endlessly, that had left the deepest mark. History often remembers wars through fire and ruin, battles, bombs, and the machinery of death. Yet within that same era of destruction, there existed moments so quiet they could almost be missed. One of them was the morning ritual in America's prisoner of war camps, the pouring of coffee, the serving of donuts, and the simple dignity of a meal shared between enemies. What seemed trivial was, in truth, revolutionary. At a time when Europe was starving, the United States proved that strength could express itself not only in might, but in restraint. The coffee poured for captured soldiers was not charity. It was policy shaped by faith in law, order, and humanity. In a world obsessed with domination, America had chosen discipline through decency. That decision rippled far beyond the fences. It softened hearts hardened by ideology, and it left its mark on every man who tasted that strange combination of defeat and dignity. Many of those German soldiers would return home and speak of it for the rest of their lives, how the enemy's greatest weapon was fairness, how the taste of coffee and fried dough carried the smell of freedom. In the decades that followed, as Europe rebuilt and Germany was reborn as a democracy, those small memories mattered. They reminded former foes that civilization is not measured by what we destroy, but by what we preserve, our sense of humanity, even in victory. The story of the German POWs in America is not one of indulgence, but of endurance. It reveals how morality, when institutionalized, can become more powerful than propaganda. It shows that even in war, the line between captor and captive can blur through mutual recognition of decency. Some victories are won with weapons, others are won with patience, policy, and a cup of hot coffee at dawn. In the stillness of those mornings, under the watchtowers and barbed wire, the world glimpsed a version of power that required no violence to prove itself. And when the last camp closed, what lingered was not the memory of fences, but the fragrance of something warmer, gentler, and far more enduring.